This is clearly, a topic that's been on my mind because we are dealing with a lot of ups and downs in, water and temperature right now. And so it's been a bit difficult to manage grasslands in a lot of ways. And we'll kind of dive into that. I think, everybody knows that the climate has been different, and, we haven't set a new normal maybe, which makes it really difficult to manage on our farms and plan. This is just, showing some data from our research site in 2020 and 2021 compared to the 30-year normal. And this is precipitation. So, in 2020 and 2021, you can see we were especially 2021, we were well below normal in precipitation up in the northern part of Vermont. But in 2022, the rest of Vermont and most of New England and the Northeast were in a severe drought, but we actually had a lot of rainfall, replenishing our soils from these really dry years that we had prior. So again, it makes it really difficult to kind of know what's next. What we used to be able to, I guess, plan for, just really difficult to plan, especially with our forages. So we're getting wetter here in Vermont. I brought this up the other day at our organic dairy conference, which, last year was so dry for so many people. It's hard to even think that we're actually have a 71% increase in the number of 2-inch rainfalls. But we are receiving more rainfall and more severe rainfall when we do get it. And I think everybody's experienced that, where, we'll have normal precipitation across the month or maybe even a season, but most of that precipitation within a month might come in one rain event or maybe two. And that, I would say, is more of what we're seeing if we get, rain at all during some of the hotter summer months. So this was from 2020. And again, you can see this is April through June, how dry parts of New England really were, and the Northeast. And again, for us, that continued on until 2022, creating a lot of issues with forage performance. And then, the temperatures overall have been warmer, but again, you can see some outliers here. The yellow line is the 30-year normal. And you can see 2019, it was cooler than normal. Actually, 2022 as well was cooler than normal. And 2020 and 2018 above normal. So, things are really fluctuating on the extremes, where it's really, really hot and maybe really dry, or really hot and really wet. So it's hard to gauge what to do, and really planning for the extremes, knowing that those are becoming actually the normal, is what we really need to be thinking about. So we actually just recently conducted a national survey of forage needs, and this was sent out to organic dairy farms to get a sense of how really the climate was impacting forage production on farms. And, farmers reported a variety of factors that were limiting forage on their operations, but, most of them were focused around weather. So severe weather fluctuations, and you can see access to adequate water for irrigation, which was a lot of our Western respondents, were big issues for people. And so what were people doing in response to adverse weather? They were having to buy more feed, which is expensive, or they were having to buy more grain, which is also expensive. And people were increasing irrigation use, and that's even occurring here. And another thing that people mentioned they were doing to sort of deal with these adverse weather conditions was increasing the amount of acreage in their grazing system, right? So when we look at all the ways that people are trying to adapt to extreme weather, it really is focused on, having to purchase more inputs and spending money to make up for lost feed. And what is happening is that it's creating a lot of financial uncertainty. Grain prices are really expensive. So having to buy more grain to make up for the lack of feed or poor feed, really reduces financial stability on farms and purchasing feed. And if somebody's increasing the acreage that they're grazing, that means that they're taking it out of, hay production, likely. And so they're not actually gaining much there. It's just probably likely making them having to purchase more feed. So we know that the climate is stressing, the livestock industry, and a lot of that has to do with the performance of our grasses. So every dairy farm and livestock operation in New England and the Northeast are grass-based. And I say that, I know most people would say, well, most conventional farmers grow corn, which is true, but the majority still of the acreage on those farms, at least in New England, is grass. Most of the farms I work with have almost either equal acres of grass versus corn, or double the acres of grass versus corn, or they're only grass. So we really rely on grasses and forages, perennial forages, to support the livestock industry, in our region. So why should we be concerned, as the climate is really becoming more erratic and shifting? So again, this is more information from the forage producers, from the survey and focus groups, but they're really struggling trying to build climate resilience on their farm, and trying to figure out how to do that as immediate as possible, because we are experiencing climate instability. And so thinking about how we'll adapt is not really what's happening. We are trying to adapt as quickly as we can. And the problem is, of course, is that everything is so erratic, it's kind of hard to adapt because, again, there's no real new normal. So, the biggest issue clearly with grass and many of the legumes that we grow is that they are productive during the cool, wetter weather. So, all of the grasses that we grow in New England and the Northeast, or most of them, are perennial cool season grasses. And these grasses, as you can see, like cooler weather, and they like ample rainfall. So in those years, and sort of during the normal years, we have a lot of grass production, basically early in the spring and in through about June. And then we go into a period that we call the summer slump, which you can see on this graph here. We see this decline in forage production during the summer months. when it gets hot and dry. And often the grasses, not always, but for parts of the summer, they actually go dormant, right? If it gets over a certain temperature and they also don't have the rainfall, they'll go dormant, and they don't stop growing, but they really slow down their growth to basically adapt to that hot and dry weather because they're cool season forages. And then you can see that production picks back up in the fall. So when we're talking about these long stretches or much longer stretches of dry weather and hot weather, our cool season forages are becoming like less and less productive because they want it to be cool and they don't want those really long periods of dry and hot. Okay. And what that does is it weakens the stands. And for farmers, all of you out there trying to graze, trying to make hay, we're getting hardly any production. And what we're getting is poor quality feed as well. But then we're also stressing the plants and creating, conditions where it's difficult for them to thrive, even once, it gets cooler and wetter, right? Because they've already sort of been really stressed out. So we're managing, more rain at times, but also these sort of longer stretches without rain, as well as a warming climate. So at some point, we likely, based on the models, will kind of be in the closer to a transition zone between where we grow cool season perennial grasses and where we grow warm season perennial grasses. Right now, that transition zone, is down near Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, but that transition zone is moving north. And I think, we're all well aware of that. So you can see here that, I want to keep track of time. You can see here the reduction in production of these grasses in a kind of a cool, wetter year. And I say wet in parentheses here. This was 2017 was a wet and cool year for us, cooler. And you can see how much higher the production is of these grasses, orchard grass and timothy, pretty standards out there on the landscape, meadow fescue. And then you can see the decline in those yields in a dry year. And 2020 was a pretty dry year for us, if you remember from that graph, but 2021 was even worse. So really what we're trying to evaluate is, of these cool season grasses, and the varieties that we have available, of those, which ones are really going to sort of withstand hot and dry better than others? We know that these grasses can withstand kind of cool and wet. That's what they like. But which ones will also sort of thrive, or at least produce enough forage to get us through those times when they happen? And that's really part of what our research is looking at. So here's 2020 through 2022 for us, which included 2 very, very dry years and 1 wet year. But you can see orchard grass is definitely a species type that is able to thrive better than something very common that we see on our landscape, which is Kentucky bluegrass. So you can see Kentucky bluegrass is about half the yield as orchard grass. And I think on my next slide here, right here, you can see most of the orange line, the orange line here is Kentucky bluegrass. And you can see that almost all of its yield is obtained in that first cut. And that first cut happens right when it's cool and wet generally, or at least cooler. And then we see a significant decline across the rest of the season. Now, of course, other grasses do that as well, but also regain as it begins to get cooler, okay, across the season. Or the decline isn't quite as severe. So you can see orchard grass produces 50% of its yield in the first cut, and then it produces, 25% of its yield in the third cut, and 30% of its yield in the fourth cut. Okay. So what you can see here, all these grasses that just sort of plummet when it gets really hot and dry. But you can see a few winners here that seem to maintain yields when it gets a little bit hotter. And that is some species like perennial ryegrass. So again, we're trying to evaluate these species and varieties and see if there's any that we know are going to become better adapted to these kind of climate extremes. And, variety is variety selection is really important. And you can see here's a meadow brome, Montana to the left and Fleet to the right. This is the same cutting. I believe this was third cut. And you can see how poorly this one variety is doing to the left versus the variety to the right. So not only are we looking at species, and here's a perennial ryegrass variety, we're looking right down to the variety to see what we can find that's best adapted, to this like crazy climate extreme. And here's a variety of orchard grass, two different varieties that look very, very different. Same harvest time, just really different performance. So besides variety, how else can we manage these temperature swings and these periods of really kind of long, dry spells and hot weather? So part of it is trying to reduce the stress on the plants, right? And also keeping the ground covered, right? So when we're harvesting or we're grazing, but I would say especially when we're harvesting for hay, people tend to mow as absolutely low as they can. Maybe leaving an inch of forage or inch of grass there, maybe, right? I mean, you can see this once, hay is mowed, you can see the ground just sort of turn brown. Now, doing that after second cut or, third cut, whenever we're moving into those hot and dry periods is the absolute worst thing to do, because what you've done is removed all the shade, okay, that those forages provide the ground. If you go out into your pastures and you have really good residual in the heat of the summer and you kind of dig down, you can feel how much cooler the ground feels, okay? Because you're creating shade and cover so that the sun isn't beating directly down on the soil and the plants. So keeping that ground cooler can be done by managing the grazing height and the hay harvest height, so that you actually are keeping shade on the ground, keeping the ground cooler, which does a bunch of things. Like, first of all, it retains moisture in the soil. It will also keep the crown. So the crown you can see in this photo is where grasses regrow from. So if you can keep that ground cooler and the crown cooler, that will keep those plants growing, right? It could keep them from going into longer periods of dormancy. So managing that with grazing and mowing is really critical as we're going into these sort of extreme weather patterns. So, a lot of people don't realize that grasses regrow from their crowns, and they don't actually form these basal tillers until flowering. So when we're harvesting really early in the season, before a plant would sort of start to flower, it makes it really slow for that plant to recover. So you want to make sure that you leave a higher cutting height so that there's some green material there so the plant can start photosynthesizing and regrow faster without actually having to pull energy out of the crown. So cutting height is really, really critical to managing these weather extremes, managing the temperature of the soil, and also protecting the microbial life in the ground. Because the microbes also do not like it when temperatures get too hot in the ground, which does happen. And when microbial activity slows, you know, everything slows down, nutrient cycling, plant growth. So again, providing that ground protection is really, really critical. And so here's just some suggestions that we provide farmers. So we really don't want to see people mowing between below 3 inches in most years for grasses in particular. Okay, 4 inches, I would say is good. If you start going over that, which is fine and may be warranted, especially in a really, really dry year, you will see, you know, a significant yield reduction. But again, if it's super dry, the quality of the feed way down at the bottom of the plant isn't that great anyway. Okay, so we did a little bit of evaluation of this, looking at cutting heights last year. It was actually really wet for us. So probably didn't make as much of a difference as, you know, if it was dry, but you can see, you know, 1.5 inches cutting height to 3 inches. We saw a little bit of a yield decline, but not a lot. When we went to 6 inches, we saw, you know, a significant yield decline by over a ton of feed. So maybe you don't want to mow that high unless it's really, really dry. But what we do gain is quality. So you can see we maximize fiber digestibility and minimize ash or soil in your forage by cutting higher as well. So you're going to get more out of that feed quality wise with a very slight yield reduction by picking that mower up. And then you're providing protection to the ground. All right. So I know that we're getting near 5:30, and one of the things somebody asked me to mention was irrigation. So I'm gonna hit on a couple of topics here, and then we'll break into the discussion. So another strategy to help during kind of extreme weather conditions is diversity in our perennial forages. So I've been talking about grasses quite a bit, but mixing grasses with legumes and other forbs is really critical to basically, you know, building resiliency, both drought, wet, and pests on your farms. So you can see here very low diversity in the blue bar and very high diversity in the purple bar, and you can just see the yield differences. When we have high diversity, high and very high diversity, our yields tend to be higher than when we have lower diversity, and they're more resilient. So, you know, we basically can maintain yields when it gets really dry or really wet, or we have a pest outbreak, because we have that diversity out there. And you can see down below, this was very low diversity, just alfalfa growing in this field. And you can see how yellow it is. We actually didn't end up getting any yield off of this because of the pest issues. This was attacked by potato leafhopper. So when we had alfalfa and grass, we actually were able to get yields because the potato leafhopper didn't attack the grass. And potato leafhopper outbreaks are increasing because of the change in climate. So our pest issues in forages are starting to increase because of the warming climate. So another approach that we're starting to look at is, you know, looking at warm season perennial and annual grasses that are adapted to that, hotter, drier weather. And again, this isn't for everyone, but it has definitely worked for some of our farmers. And you can see this yellow bar here really filling that void in the middle of the summer when our cool season perennial forages are kind of at a decline. And as that gap, sort of that slump gets wider, these summer annuals or perennials may become much more important. All right, so, and let's end on irrigation. So in Vermont, we do have a number of farmers now irrigating pastures, probably more pastures than hay ground, especially organic farms that rely on pasture or have to meet a certain dry matter intake from grazing their cows. Some farms clearly have been really struggling to meet that dry matter intake. And as I showed you before, because they have to meet a level of dry matter intake from pasture, they're taking hay ground and making it pasture, so they have enough. But some farms have started to irrigate. And we have different types of irrigation going in. There's these pod irrigation, which I've worked with a little bit on farms, and you can see a setup here. It's pretty, I would say low cost. There's a little bit more management there, low water flow. So there's, some advantages to using this pod irrigation. But, we've used this and we've used kind of reel or gun irrigation. Gun irrigation is less, efficient. And you have to definitely have a really good source of water to be able to irrigate, which is a challenge for some people already. But most of the farmers that I work with that are irrigating are near, a body of water. So Lake Champlain. I don't know a ton of people that are irrigating from wells, and maybe somebody on the call does. But we definitely have seen differences in yields from irrigating. Even in relatively normal years, we see an increase from irrigation. And you can see here some data we collected on a farm in Swanton, Vermont, where we were using this pod system. And you can see, with irrigation, the paddocks recovered, much faster than they normally would in July and August with and without irrigation. And again, this was a cooler, wetter year, and we still saw quite a difference. And then yields as well being higher. So irrigation probably will become more common in our area for some people. The cost of this particular system was around $20,000 for a 20-acre setup. I'm sure this price has gone up. The biggest cost to most people would be installing the well and having the water source. But in this case, the farm was on the lake, so they had plenty of water to draw from. But again, something that a lot of farmers are thinking about.